Welcome to Revelation Made Simple Seminar. Thank you for joining us once again for another presentation tonight. And tonight we're going to study a very important chapter in the book of Revelation, and that is chapter 17. So let's get straight into the Word of God and start reading chapter 17. Verses 1 to 6. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, "Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Verse 4. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So Revelation 17 provides a description of the end-time Babylon for the purpose of showing the reason for the judgment upon her. Revelation 18 will describe the judgment upon this end-time apostate religious system and her demise, and we'll see that in the next presentation. Now, 2 times John announced the collapse of end-time Babylon without identifying it. We saw that in Revelation 14 verse 8 and Revelation 16 verse 19. So now he provides the description and identification of Babylon in terms of a prostitute in her seductive role at the time of the end. So let's look at the text a little bit more closely. In verse 1, it says, one of the angels. This angel is most likely the 7th-bowl angel who announced the collapse of Babylon in Revelation 16 and verse 19. This suggests that what the angel is about to explain to John in Revelation 17 and 18 elaborates upon what was portrayed in the 6th plague in Revelation 16, 12 to 16. Then John sees a great prostitute. In Revelation 17, verse 5, John identifies this prostitute as Babylon the Great. John uses the figure of Babylon to portray the prevailing apostate religious system in the world, allied with the state and its related authorities at the time of the end. Now, it says that this woman was sitting on many waters. The prostitute was sitting on many waters. This expression is taken from Jeremiah, where the prophet describes ancient Babylon as dwelling by many waters of the river Euphrates. Jeremiah 51 and verse 13. In verse 2, the angel further explains that this prostitute, this woman he saw, is one with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. These kings stand for the governing political powers of the world that will place their authority and influence in the service of the end-time apostate religious system, Babylon. Now, committed fornication is the language of fornication is often used by the prophets in the Old Testament with reference to illicit relationships of Israel with surrounding apostate and disobedient nations. Spiritual fornication means exchanging God with other gods. It means idolatry. And it means accepting falsehoods and falling into apostasy. The adulterous wine of Babylon that first seduces the political powers of the world also affects those dwelling on earth who follow their lead and in turn become, as we showed already, drunk with the wine of her fornication. This is the way the end-time Babylon will gain control over the nations of the world by means of deception. This wine of her fornication is the deceptions of the end-time Babylon. And when they become drunk, when you're drunk, there is no ability to really reason and think. So they're at the point where they have drunk from these deceptions, and there is no way back for them anymore. In verse 3, John sees a woman sitting on the scarlet beast. Early in Revelation 17:1, the prostitute was said to sit on many waters. Now here John sees this woman sitting on the scarlet beast. Now here John uses one of the techniques that he has used previously in the book of Revelation a few times, and this technique is called I heard and I saw. Here in chapter 17, John first hears that the great prostitute is sitting on many waters. He didn't see that, he only heard. Now later, here in verse 3, John sees the woman sitting on the scarlet beast. So this suggests that both the waters and the beast refer to the same thing, namely the secular and political powers of the world. What John first hears and what he subsequently sees is one and the same thing in the book of Revelation. The fact that Babylon sits upon the waters and on the beast indicates that this end-time religious system has gained control over the secular and political powers of the world. Yet, she is also dependent on the beast to enforce her plans and purposes. They are dependent on each other. The beast and the woman, they're dependent on each other. They're connected. That is why this will be a union between the beast and the woman to enforce the woman's agenda in the last days. The color scarlet or red is the color of blood and oppression. The beast of Revelation 17 is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. The language used here for the beast upon which Babylon sits is remarkably similar to the description that we saw of the sea beast in Revelation chapter 13. Now, this suggests that the beast of Revelation 17 is a continuation of the power from Revelation 13 that has a long history of oppressing God's people. In verse 4, now John turns his attention to the woman, and he sees the woman also being clothed in purple and scarlet. Now, the scarlet, which is the color of blood and oppression, corresponds to the scarlet color of the beast upon which she sits. Also, in ancient times, the scarlet dress and lavish decoration were worn by a prostitute for seduction, so she's wearing the appropriate clothes to seduce all the nations. In ancient times, purple was often used for royal garments. End-time Babylon jewelry consists of gold and precious stones and pearls. Now, the gold and precious stones and pearls adorn New Jerusalem in her glory in Revelation 21, verse 11. This suggests that the prostitute Babylon is a contrast to New Jerusalem, the bride of the Lamb. Is a counterfeit New Jerusalem, so to speak. In her hand, the prostitute holds a golden cup full of abominations and the unclean things of her fornication. Jeremiah speaks of Babylon in Jeremiah 51, verse 7 to 8, and he says that Babylon is a golden cup in the hand of the Lord, intoxicating all the earth. So this is an imagery that is borrowed from the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. So end-time Babylon is said to make all the people drunk with the cup of her fornication for the purpose of worshiping the beast. In verse 5, On the forehead of the prostitute, John sees an inscription which is a divine mystery. The inscription is Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abomination of the earth. So Babylon will unite all false and apostate religious systems, the act that makes Babylon the mother of prostitutes of the earth. That's why she's the mother. All the daughters, all the other apostate religious system will be united in this one at the end time, and it will create this end time system, the spiritual Babylon. Babylon in the Old Testament stands for the beginning of the rebellion against God. The first time Babylon is mentioned in the Bible is at the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, where people wanted to build a tower that will reach to heaven in verse 4, Genesis 11 verse 4. Since then, Babylon became the symbol of rebellion and resistance against God throughout history. In verse 6, John is astonished with a great marvel. However, he does not state the reason for his astonishment. It is possible, however, that the real reason for John's astonishment is that this seductive woman that he sees here is somewhat familiar to him. The fact that he sees her in the desert could remind him of the other woman in the wilderness who he saw previously in the vision in Revelation chapter 12. This woman in the wilderness signified the church faithful to God during a period of time, times, and half a time. And this woman, the dragon went to persecute this woman, and the woman fled into the desert, into the wilderness, because God, it says there, provided eagle's wings, and she fled into the wilderness where God could care for this woman in the wilderness. So John is marveled because when he left that woman, she was a pure woman. Now she's a prostitute woman. The symbol of what appears to be two different women actually refers to the same religious entity in different times and circumstances. As we saw when John left her in the wilderness in chapter 12, when he saw her the first time, she was a pure woman. Now when he sees her again, she is a scarlet. She's a prostitute. She's an apostate woman. It is no surprise then that John is filled with great astonishment when he sees the woman of Babylon. This would explain why God's end time people in Revelation are referred to as the remnant, the remaining ones of the woman's offspring in Revelation 12:17, rather than the woman, because later on the woman apostatizes. Now we go to the second part of chapter 17, verses 7 to 9. But the angel said to me, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carries her, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast you saw was and is not, and it will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition." Excuse me. "And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits." Verse 10. "There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is gone to perdition. The 10 horns which you saw are the 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, For he is Lord of lords and Kings of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Verses 15 to 18. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Very complicated imagery here. A lot of formulas. The one that was, is, and yet to come. There's 7 heads. 5 have fallen. 1 is yet to come. Then there's a lot of complicated imagery, so let's try to put this all together. Revelation 17, 1 to 6, the first portion that we just looked at, describes in general terms the end-time apostate power, which is Babylon, providing some background to explain its function. Now, beginning with verse 7, John provides detailed information, especially with reference to the identity of the beast upon which prostitute Babylon sits, and regarding the beast's function at the time of the end. So let's look at that. In verse 7, the angel responds to John's amazement by promising him to explain to him the mystery of the woman and of the beast which carries her. John is perplexed with the mystery of the prostitute, and yet the angel promises to also explain the mystery of the beast. Because remember, we said that those two are interconnected. You have to understand them together. The mystery involves both the woman and the beast. The two are inseparable. For the woman derives her character and power from the beast. Understanding the identity of the beast is key to understanding the true nature of the end-time Babylon. In verse 8, the angel explains to John that the scarlet beast on which Babylon sits is the one that was and is not and is about to come up out of the abyss. This formula indicates that the beast passes through 3 phases of his existence. The beast's past, present, and future. These phases are to be identified with the 7 heads. Thus, throughout its existence, the beast exercises oppressive rule through one of its heads during different periods in history. Each head of the beast is a partial incarnation of satanic power that rules for a given period. So let's look at this. First, the beast was. This points most likely to the beast, to the sea beast from Revelation chapter 13 with the 7 heads and 10 horns. One of his heads, says in Revelation 13, was wounded to the point of death. Second, the beast was, now second, the beast is not. So namely, the beast is not active on the scene. The beast is wounded for some time. Then the beast will return from the dead after the mortal wound has been healed, and the beast will appear again before the time of the end in renewed fury against God. Third, the beast comes up from the abyss. In this context, the word abyss or bottomless pit functions as the place of the dead, the grave, the underworld, and that's explained in in Romans 10, verse 7. Descending into the abyss would represent the receiving of the mortal wound, dying for a while, and then subsequently the beast disappears for a while from the world scene. In the end times, this beast will come up from the abyss with full satanic manifestation. yet he will appear for only a short time before departs into destruction. So, the purpose of chapter 17 of Revelation is to give us some more details about the beast that goes through these three phases of its existence, which is clearly the beast from Revelation chapter 13. The angel will clarify that to John through the explanation of the meaning of the seven heads. He will clarify the identity of this beast. Also, the other reason for the chapter 17 is to explain who the woman that sits on the beast is. So let's look at that. In verse 9, with the statement, "Here's the mind with wisdom," the angel is saying, here's the wisdom which calls for understanding of things you see. Wisdom here refers to a spiritual insight to understand the true nature of the things that are happening here in the vision. This wisdom was required earlier in understanding the cryptic number of the sea beast, 666. In Revelation 13:18. So this is the same type of understanding, the wisdom to understand the explanation of the identity of this beast and the woman. So the angel says, the seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman is sitting. Now the angel first explains that the existence of the beast and his activities are identified with his heads. The beast has been active throughout history through its successive heads. The expression on which the woman is sitting suggests that the mountains are the same as many waters in verse 1 and scarlet beast, verse 3, representing the secular and political powers of the world. Now let's look at the seven mountains. There has been some misunderstanding in regards to the seven mountains. That's why we have a different interpretation of the seven heads. The Greek oros here means mountain rather than hill, as used by some translators who believe that the city of Rome is in view here. Most modern commentators argue that this is undeniable evidence that the great harlot of Revelation 17 is imperial Rome, because Rome was widely known in the first century as the city that sits on the seven hills. In verse 10, the context, we find that the context doesn't really support that. In verse 10, the context indicates that Rome is not intended here, because John immediately explains that the mountains on which the prostitute sits are used metaphorically for seven kings, and kings stand for kingdoms. So these are not seven hills. These are seven kings or seven kingdoms. In the Old Testament, kings often mean kingdoms, as we saw in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. So the seven mountains are the same as seven heads, which are also the seven kings. Mountain, heads, and kings are all synonymous here in Revelation chapter 17. And they stand for successive world powers that dominated the world throughout history and through which Satan has worked to oppose God's people throughout history. Thus, the great prostitute, the woman that we saw in the beginning that is sitting on the beast, finds her support from the beast who appears in history in succession of secular, godless kingdoms. The great prostitute sits upon a succession of empires. Now, verse 10 says that 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other one has not yet come. So let's look at that. This is the main part of chapter 17. If we are to understand chapter 17, we need to understand that the 7 heads, all right? 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. 7 in total. There are 2 main views that have been developed, 2 main interpretations about who these 7 heads are. The main point in both views is to identify the head that is. That's head number 6. So, first, some authors have suggested the sequence of the heads or / kings should be viewed from the end time perspective rather than from John's perspective. Second, this is the second view, other authors argue the sixth head or king, which must be understood from John's viewpoint at the time of the writing of Revelation, which is the 1st century AD. So they say that the head that has to be viewed from John's perspective in 1st century AD. So that should be the one, the empire that was ruling at that time, in John's time, should be the sixth head, the one that is. So let's look at this parallel to each other. The first view, I'm going to put them on the screen here. First view says this: the five that have fallen is Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Imperial Rome, Papal Rome, 5 of them. The one that is France during French Revolution, which we looked at in Revelation chapter 11. It's the beast that comes out of the abyss, of the bottomless pit. And the 7th one that is yet to come is United States, the lamb-like beast of Revelation chapter 13. Now the second view goes like this: the 5 that have fallen are Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. The one that is, from John's perspective, when he was writing the book of Revelation, the Roman Empire, Imperial Rome, was ruling. So that was the head that is from John's time. And the one that is yet to come after that is the papacy. Okay, it's the Papal Rome. Now, also, we will see that there is an 8th head, okay, in this formula. And according to the first view, the 8th head is the revived Papal Rome. And according to the second view is also the revived papacy, which is the healing of the mortal wound, when the papacy will come back after the healing of the mortal wound. So both of them are seeing the same way in this view. Now, I have done this seminar before, and I have been researching a lot about this chapter. It's a very complicated chapter, very complicated formula here. I have always held the position, the second view. That was the view that I have accepted for myself after a lot of research and studying for myself. And so when I was preparing again for this seminar, as you see, the second view, that's the one that I held, from the time I've been researching this and studying. But when I was reading this time, and I read probably 30 times over chapter 17 over and over and over again, I wanted to allow the text to speak to me. I would start to observe some inconsistency with both of these views. Something doesn't fit correctly there. So let me show to you the problem with the first view, and the problem with the both of them is the head that is. The 6th one is the biggest problem in both of these views. So if you look at the first view, according to Revelation 17, John in the beginning of the vision is taken in the spirit, in the vision, is taken in the wilderness to see the scarlet beast during the 6th head. So the beast that he sees right away in the beginning has to be the one that he sees, that is the 6th head, the one that is. So according to this view, if we follow the first view, that would be France during French Revolution, which does not fit the text of Revelation chapter 17. If we go to the second view, once again, the problem is with the 6th head, the one that is. In this view, the 6th head, the one that is Imperial Rome, the head that reigned at the time of John. Once again, that does not fit the text of Revelation 17. There is another problem with the second view. The second view includes Egypt and Assyria from the beginning, and this Egypt and Assyria does not fit in this succession of empires here. Egypt and Assyria does not appear in any of the prophetic lists as as empires listed in the book of Daniel or Revelation. We have the empires listed in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11, and we don't find them anywhere. Even Revelation chapter 13, the beast is described as 4 of those empires: Babylon, Greece, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. And so Egypt and Assyria doesn't really fit here in this list. So I start seeing inconsistencies, and then I thought, then what does this 7 heads represent? What is the list that's supposed to be? So let me present to you, in my humble opinion, in my study, in my research, what I have arrived to. Okay? And that has been after a lot of reading the text of the book of Revelation, special chapter 17, but connecting it to chapter 12 and to chapter 13. This is what I arrived to. The 5 that have fallen are the same as in the first view I showed it to you. That must be there. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Imperial Rome, and Papal Rome. That's there, the 5 that have fallen. Now the challenge is to identify the 6th head, right? I told you that's the challenge in every interpretation, in any view that we have looked at. Since both views from previously have some problems, I believe that we need to look at the 7 heads from John's prophetic perspective, from the time when he was taken in the Spirit in the wilderness. So John is taken into the wilderness to see the beast. In Revelation 12, he saw the woman, the pure church, go into the wilderness to be protected by God. He left the church there in the wilderness. He left the woman there in the wilderness at the beginning of the reign of the Papal Rome, which is number 5 on the list. Now it seems that John is taken back to the wilderness towards the end of the reign of the Papal Rome, towards the end of the period of 1260 years of persecution of the woman. Now, this beast clearly resembles the sea beast from Revelation 13:1. We have the 7 heads and 10 horns and names of blasphemy, which is the papacy in Revelation 13, verse 1. So Revelation 13 is the key to understand the succession of 7 heads in Revelation 17. So based on the parallel between Revelation 12, 13, and 17, the conclusion I came to in regards to the identity of the 6th head is that it represents the wounded Papal Rome. It's different from many other views that you'll hear. Let me explain myself. The wounded Papal Rome, the papacy, the beast that had the mortal wound from Revelation 13, and then we see it here in Revelation 17. What made me arrive to this conclusion? I found the evidence in the text. Now let me show it to you. If you look at Revelation 13 and Revelation 17, even though there are many similarities between the beast in Revelation 13 and 17, there are 2 differences. One is apparent and one is not as apparent. The first one, in Revelation 13, and I'll put it on the screen. The first difference, in Revelation 13, there were 10 crowns on the horns, where in Revelation 17, the crowns are missing. They are not mentioned in Revelation 17. Now, the omission of the crowns means that the beast of Revelation 13, which was the Papal Rome, goes through the phase of the mortal wound at the time when John sees it in the wilderness. It means that the beast lost its political power for a while. So the 6th head should be interpreted according to this clue that we get here as the wounded Papal Rome. Now, some of you might say that if it's wounded, then it should not be counted as a head. Even though it is wounded, we know from history that even during this time, the papacy was operating in the background to establish its influence through different avenues, through different societies. I believe that it was even easier for them to do so because they were out of the spotlight, so to speak, so they were working in the background. Now, but the question that I still had in my head while I was looking at this, do we have textual evidence? Remember, in my seminar, I always go to the text. If the text doesn't speak to us, we must look at things and find a different explanation. The text must speak to us. So the question I still had, do we have textual evidence in Revelation to count this wounded head as one of the seven? Can we count this wounded head as one of the seven heads? And the answer is yes. We find that in Revelation 13 and verse 3. John says, and I saw one of his heads. Remember, he sees the beast with seven heads. And then he says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded. And his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. It's right there. One of the heads was wounded, but it was still counted among the seven ones. He even saw it wounded. So a wounded head can still be counted with the seven heads. Another parallel that is clear here with Revelation 13 verse 3 is with Revelation 17 verse 8. The beast that you saw was and is not and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel. You see the parallel there? And the world will marvel and follow the beast. And those who dwell on earth, these are the world, will marvel after this beast who just was and is and came back. So what's happening here? We see another parallel here. John is showing in the vision in chapter 13 the wounded head, but he was not given much details about that. So here in chapter 17 we find more details. So we have the textual evidence to support the counting of the wounded head as one of the seven heads of the beast. Now, I told you, the first difference between Revelation 13 and 17 was that there was no crowns. That shows the mortal wound. But there is another, the second difference. In Revelation 17, we have the woman sitting on the beast, where in Revelation 13, the woman is not mentioned. That is very significant. It's a significant difference, and it provides more details for us. Now, when we talk about the wounded beast, we usually present the wound as an isolated event when the Pope was taken captive by General Berthier in 1798. Nothing wrong with that. But I believe that that was the last blow to the papacy in inflicting the mortal wound. If we look in history, the wound was inflicted on papacy gradually. It was a gradual process. That the taking into captivity was just the final blow, but it came gradually over the years, over centuries, and I'll show it to you from history. The text here in Revelation 17 seems to suggest that the woman that was sitting on the beast had something to do with this. She contributed to the process of the wounding of the beast. Now, this is very ironic. The irony is that the woman contributed to the process of inflicting the deadly wound to the papacy. Later on, the papacy will contribute to the process of apostatizing or wounding the woman. That's very ironic. Even though in the past these two were in conflict, the woman and the beast were in conflict with each other and opposed to each other, in the end time these two will become allies because the woman is sitting on the beast. They're together. A wounded beast is more dangerous than anything else. And so papacy proved to be very dangerous and very powerful influence in leading the woman into apostasy. This process of the wounding of the beast started with the Reformation of the 16th century. I'm going to show you a little bit of history of this process. And that is important because the woman on the beast in the past was the pure church that was in the wilderness hiding from persecution. We see that in Revelation chapter 12. But then Reformation helped the woman to come out of the wilderness, and at this time the woman, in my opinion, becomes the Protestant church. Now, history shows us that at this time, when the Reformation is separating the Protestant church from the Catholic church in terms of religion, there was a great push for those Protestant countries to separate from the political influence of the Catholic Church as well. That is where we have the European wars of religion, and you see that on the screen. European wars of religion, which were a series of religious wars waged in the 16th and 17th century Europe. The wars were fought in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, which disrupted the religious order in the Catholic countries of Europe. During this time, the woman becomes apostate. And that is why when John sees the woman in the wilderness in the beginning of the vision in chapter 17, he's astonished because the woman was pure before, but it is not anymore. Now, this is where we come to the seventh head. So in my opinion, based on the text and the history, the sixth head should be counted as the wounded papacy. So you see the first five that have fallen already. The sixth one is the wounded papal Rome, wounded papacy, the head that was wounded, mortally wounded. Now the seventh head. In Revelation 12:15-6, we see the serpent, who is Satan, and there it says that Satan, the serpent, spewed out water from his mouth like a flood after the woman. This can mean both physical persecution and spiritual deception. So Satan comes after the woman with physical persecution and with deception. Verse 16 says that the earth helped the woman. According to Revelation 13, the earth was the United States. So in order to escape religious persecution in Europe, many Protestants fled to the New World, to United States. This is where Protestantism would flourish and grow. At the same time, Protestantism is becoming more and more the scarlet woman presented in Revelation 17, meaning that it becomes the apostate Protestantism. So the seventh head is the United States of America, the lamb-like beast of Revelation chapter 13. This head will continue only for a short time, says Revelation 17:10. Now, how does that fit into what we're describing here? Well, I believe it fits very well. How? According to Revelation 13, United States as a country promoted freedom of religion. That's how they were organized, as a republic, promoting separation of church and state and promoting freedom of religion. But according to Revelation 13, the United States, the one that promotes freedom of religion, separation of church and state, will come to its end. And that is why the only time that United States is referred to as the lamb-like beast, the one that is promoting the freedom of religion, is found only in Revelation 13. After that, Revelation calls United States the false prophet, and it's mentioned a few times in chapter 16 and onward. So the title lamb-like beast points out to the original political nature of United States, a republic that separates states and religion. The title false prophet points out to the religious nature of United States in the last conflict. After the United States, as the earth beast leads the charge to set up an image to the beast, this is when it changes its nature. So to speak, it morphs. From the lamb-like beast, it morphs into the false prophet. United States becomes a false prophet because it has a more religious identity. So in verse 11, the beast that was and is not is himself also the eighth head, and is of the seven, and is going to perdition. So which one is the eighth head? The eighth head is the restored papacy. And as you can see in all three views, in those ones that I presented and this third one that I put together after my research, the eighth head is always the restored papacy, and that's an important point to mention. The eighth head is the restored papacy when the mortal wound will be completely healed. We evidently today, in my opinion, live in the era of the transition between the seventh and the eighth head, when the mortal wound is being slowly healed. According to Revelation chapter 13, the mortal wound will be completely healed when the beast from the earth, United States, will influence everyone to make an image to the beast and force everyone to accept the mark of the beast. The religious power of the sea beast, which is the papacy, will combine with the political power of the earth beast to create the religious political power that will persecute God's people in the last days. The woman on the beast is in its eighth head phase will be the image of the beast. The alliance between the woman and the beast form what we call in Revelation, the end time Babylon. So it appears that the Protestants, American Protestantism, will lead the charge in the final conflict of this earth's history. American Protestantism, the apostate Protestantism, is the woman that sits on the scarlet beast. Let me show you Great Controversy, page 588. Through the two great errors, the immortality of the soul and Sunday sacredness, Satan will bring the people under his deceptions. While the former lays the foundation of spiritualism, the latter creates a bond of sympathy with Rome. The Protestants of the United States will be foremost in stretching their hands across the gulf to grasp the hands of spiritualism. They will reach over the abyss to clasp hands with the Roman power, and under the influence of this threefold union, this country, which means the United States, will follow in the steps of Rome in trampling on the rights of conscience. So the Protestant will be leading the charge in the last days. The apostate Protestantism here in the United States. Protestants in America, specifically evangelical Protestants, have become a very powerful political power. They're powerful political movement today. I want to be very clear. When I'm talking about Protestantism or evangelicalism or even the Catholic Church, I'm not talking about the members of that church. I'm talking about the organization in general. And specifically, when I'm talking about apostate Protestantism or evangelicalism, I'm talking about the radical Christian right. I'm not talking about everyday evangelical Christian. It's the same way when we say the sea beast represents the Catholic Church. We're not saying it represents every Catholic. It's the organization. It's the papacy. So, when we talk about the evangelicalism, Protestantism here, evangelical Protestantism here in the United States, we see recurrent themes that are, that are used in their discourse. They always talk about the religious things to be imposed in United States, and they want to legislate those things. They're talking about battling against secularism. They talk about creation evolution controversy. They talk about abortion a lot. And the notion of the United States, they talk about a notion of the United States as a Christian nation. Those things in themselves are great. But then when you want to legislate those things and force them on the other side, that is wrong. Now, today evangelicals are predominantly conservative-leaning individuals. Their religious faith and biblical interpretations are often used to validate their political views, and that's where the problem is going to come later, when that becomes radicalized. So the book of Revelation shows that apostate Protestantism will lead the charge in regards to last day events. In the last days, this apostate woman will become radicalized, and the nation that helped her, United States, will give her the power to become the image of the beast. Backed by a restored papacy, which is the beast in its 8th head phase, and the United States, which is the earth beast or / false prophet, the woman will become the persecuting power in the end time. This alliance between the woman and the beast gives rise to the end time Babylon. Let's move on and finish chapter 17, sorry. Verse 12, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings which have not yet received a kingdom. So their identity is not specified in the text, and no indication of their previous history is mentioned here. Some people say that they should be identified as political powers such as NATO, G8, or United Europe, European Union. We don't know. Others say that they stand symbolically for the totality of nations in the world that will put themselves into the service of the beast. And I tend to agree with the second one. Number 10 stands for the totality of nations. Only time will tell which, if any of these views are correct. Since the text does not reveal their identity, all we can conclude at this point is that they will emerge at the very end time after the healing of the wound of the beast will take place. So it says they will receive authority as kings over the world together with the beast for 1 hour. This is a very short time period, 1 hour. So they will receive the authority with the beast. So they will be together, united with the end time Babylon. In verse 13, what the text clearly states is that the 10 kings are integrally connected with the beast. They collectively have one purpose. It says they are of one mind and they give their power and authority to the beast. Whoever or whatever these 10 kings are, they evidently constitute the last phase of this beast's power. They represent the end-time unity of the governing political powers of the world, which will submit to the authority of the beast at the end time. The 10 kings will become the backbone in the creation of this religious political system in this final crisis. The beast will use them, these kings, to enforce his plans and purposes. In verse 14, the 10 kings will make war with the Lamb. Now, this climatic, things change here. The kings are together with the beast and accomplishing the purpose of the beast, but then things change. At one point, it says that the kings will make, here we're still talking about the 10 kings will make war with the Lamb. This battle will take place in Revelation 19, verse 11 to 21. This affirms the idea that the final battle in the great eschatological showdown is against Christ and his faithful people, because they are described here chosen and faithful. So God will also be with his remnant who are described faithful and chosen in the midst of this fierce persecution. Now, the final battle is clearly, once again, we mentioned many times, but once again, we should mention it's not political here. It's not a military battle. Babylon's aim to defeat God's people will be reversed to her own defeat, and this is where things changed. Now, the kings are together with end-time Babylon fighting against the Lamb, having the war against the Lamb and the chosen ones and faithful ones. Now, things reverse. Because it says the Lamb will overcome them. And it reversed to her own defeat. The Lamb overcomes this political power. In verse 15, The angel now identifies the waters upon which the end-time Babylon sits. He says that the waters are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. In the Old Testament, water is often used figuratively for the enemies of God's people. So the waters upon which Babylon sits symbolize governing secular and political powers of the world. And now in verse 16, in the final stage, the picture suddenly dramatically changes right here, as I mentioned before, but it changes here. The drunken prostitutes' lovers, the 10 horns, the 10 kings, then have loyally supported Babylon, now awaken from their drunkenness and turn against their mistress. The very powers that have up to this point loyally supported Babylon now withdraw their support and turn against Babylon. It appears that we have an elaboration of the sixth plague here. The river Euphrates, upon which Babylon is sitting, was dried up. That meant that the political powers of this world will withdraw their support, and something similar is mentioned here. Now, the disillusioned worldwide political powers will make Babylon, says, desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh. Eating somebody's flesh in the Old Testament is a savage action of an enemy. Then they will burn her up with fire, it says. In the Old Testament, burning with fire is the punishment for a terrible act of immorality. These cruel acts remind one of the prophecies of Ezekiel about judgment falling upon the prostitute Jerusalem. In both Ezekiel and Revelation, former lovers are responsible for the punishment of the prostitute. They turn against the prostitute, and we have the same here. The former lovers, which are the 10 kings, these are ruling powers, civil powers, they turn against Babylon. Interestingly, the punishment for the prostitute in the Bible is death penalty by burning with fire rather than death by stoning. Burning with fire was the form of punishment reserved for a daughter of a priest. It says in Leviticus 21, verse 9. So, only a daughter of a priest, the punishment was to burn her when she was involved in prostitution. The other ones were just stoned. Only a daughter of a priest was burnt with a fire. The fact that the fate of the prostitute Babylon is stated in terms of burning by fire rather than stoning is a further indication that the woman of chapter 17 denotes a religious rather than a political entity. That once was the true church, faithful to God, and now is not. So she became a prostitute, and her punishment will be like the punishment of a daughter of a priest, to be burnt with fire. Verse 17, the angel further explains that it was God who has brought about the destruction of Babylon. He says, for God has put into their hearts to do his purpose. In believing that they are working out the purpose of the beast, the united governing political powers are in fact unconsciously carrying out God's purposes to bring judgment upon Babylon. The truth behind this is that God never loses control of human affairs. It is God who permits the end-time powers to come together to serve Babylon. When he withdraws, however, the united powers immediately turn against Babylon and destroy her. The final crisis will bring God's purposes to an ultimate conclusion. In verse 18, it says, the woman whom you saw is the great city which rules over the kings of the earth. The great city is Babylon. So prostitute Babylon and the great city Babylon are the same things. They symbolize the same end-time religious system that stands in opposition to God. Divine judgment is now set into motion against this end-time religious system. This judgment is described in Revelation 17, and we'll see that in our next presentation. And it's described there in terms of the destruction of the ancient city of Babylon, that has grown wealthy through economic trade. And this is where we're ending the presentation tonight. Just want to thank you all for joining us tonight and watching this presentation. Please remember to go to our website and download our notes, the notes from each night. The website is revelationmadesimple.com, and if you have questions, please email us, and the email is info@revelationmadesimple.com. Thank you once again for being here with us. We'll see you next time. God bless you.